Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, we would love you to. And you can do so at patreon.com/the History Network. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 38, Episode 2, Colenso, Ireland's Forgotten Sacrifice in the Boer War. This episode was written by Sam de Turberville. Sam de Turberville is a teacher and author with a passion for uncovering lesser-known stories from the past. Based in Ireland, he has a keen interest in early modern history, from the Age of Enlightenment to the First World War. When he isn't researching or teaching or writing history, he enjoys motorsport and playing guitar. He hopes to write for us again soon. Yet another war believed to be over by Christmas. The Second Boer War was fought between the greatest empire the world had ever seen and a nation of farmers with a population fewer than that of Brighton, England. It took the might of the British Empire 3 years to subdue these farmers, who were known as Boers. The Boers believed they were fighting for their right to self-govern, and the British fought to keep control of the mineral-rich lands of the southern tip of Africa. Irish men were found on both sides of the conflict, nearly 14,000 kilometres from home. Irishmen such as the 150 Irish Commandos fighting for the Transvaal Republic, commanded by men like John MacBride, brought their expertise back to Ireland to take part in the 1916 Rising. Others fought for what they believed was right, for glory, for money. The war left an indelible mark in the heart of Dublin City in the form of a triumphal arch by St. Stephen's Green. Every day many Dubliners walk under this arch dedicated to the fallen Irish of the war. However, few take time to observe the names etched onto its walls because of the animosity gained by Irish men fighting for the British at the advent of the 20th century. The arch was given the nickname Traitor's Gate. This episode will tell the story of those men who were ridiculed and abandoned by the land they called home. The Tugela River meandered slowly through the South African countryside, and to the west of Colenso it slowed to form loops and salients with few navigable drifts. The Boers knew this land, and the British did not. Eager to travel deeper into the heart of South Africa and away from the rule of the British, entire Boer families trekked in great numbers in their wagons, seeking new lands to settle and farm. These farmers were mainly of Dutch descent and devoutly Christian. The Boers believed that this land was theirs and their children's by right. However, much of this land was either bought or taken from the tribes living there. The uneasy coexistence of Boer, British and native tribes resulted in the First Boer War, 1880 to 1881, which saw Boer victory and the establishment of the South African republics. The republics were recognized by the British government and were allowed to have control over their own internal affairs. However, the British held the right to enact international policies. The Boer Transvaal Republic and the Orange Free State were blessed with great mineral wealth. The Transvaal had enormous stores of gold, making it potentially one of the richest powers in southern Africa. This troubled peace could not last when it came to the attention of the British authorities the vast amounts of gold which were being mined in the republics. The Second Boer War was an example of how military technology exceeded the tactics employed by armies at the time. Firearm technology had advanced to a new terrifying zenith. Bolt-action rifles, smokeless cartridges, percussive artillery shells, and perhaps most terrifying of all, the machine gun. All of these advancements, perhaps the most pertinent to this history, is that of smokeless ammunition. In eras past, great clouds of smoke would erupt out the end of a rifle or musket once fired, making it plainly obvious where it was fired from. Smokeless ammunition allowed the soldier to remain invisible to the enemy. The Boers, many of whom were equipped with new smokeless Mauser rifles, adopted a doctrine of skirmishing instead of the classic British line of battle as seen in the Napoleonic era. This gap was to be exploited with great effect by the Boer commandos, as they knew the way in which the British Army had fought over the course of the previous century. The British expected this to be just another of their innumerable colonial wars, and had been employing tactics of well-disciplined and organised troops firing rifles, led by a strict chain of command. These tactics had been employed all over the world in successful wars against the Zulus and Sudanese within the previous 20 years. Prior to the outbreak of the war, the Boer government had been stockpiling weapons and ammunition for the impending conflict with Great Britain. Each white male citizen in the Boer republics were to have their own firearm and a horse, and this was easily accomplished as most lived off the land and ate what they farmed and hunted. Boer General Joubert had bought perhaps as many as 30,000 state-of-the-art Mauser rifles which fired smokeless ammunition, and began to sell and loan these to willing Boers. These rifles were revolutionary. They could fire up to 2,000 yards. Added to that, the smokeless powder meant it was near impossible to see where the fire was coming from. The Boers loved these Mausers so much that the phrase "through God and the Mauser" crept its way into common usage. Joubert also purchased modern field guns from German manufacturer Krupp, as well as guns from French and even British companies. Due to lack of experience and formal training, the Boers bought explosive ammunition for their field guns, which proved to be largely ineffective in battle, unless the round landed on rocky terrain and shattered to create shrapnel. However, many of these rounds failed to even explode. The British implemented airburst rounds, which would shower an enemy combatant in lethal shrapnel. These rounds were employed to great effect on the open fields of battle. As soon as the war officially broke out, the European arms market was closed to the Boers due to a British naval blockade, so the failure in the choice of ammunition and lack of appropriate ammunition could not be remedied. The Boer commando tactics relied heavily on guerrilla-style warfare to counteract the British heavily disciplined but rigid rank and file. Boer officers were elected by their communities, but the soldiers did not have to directly follow orders. They also did not adopt a formal military formation in battle, instead fighting in loose formation, finding cover wherever it may be. This gave Boers a clear tactical advantage over the British. As many Boers were farmers and hunters, they were expert horsemen, allowing them to be highly mobile, and expert marksmen, which allowed them to be highly lethal when they encountered an enemy force. Many Boers had been firing weapons since childhood, and due to living off the land, were highly skilled in field craft. The two Boer republics declared war on the 14th of October 1899 and began aggressively by invading Natal in the east, Kimberley in the west, and Mafeking in the northwest, as well as crossing the Orange River into the British-held Cape Colony. This early invasion caught the British garrison in South Africa completely off guard, and their initial numbers were inadequate to deal with the multi-front invasion. In response, the British sent an army corps under Sir Redvers Buller to counter the Boer invasion, but it would take time to muster. The Boers fought 3 battles in quick succession: Talana Hill, 20th of October, Elandslaagte, 21st of October, and Ladysmith on the 30th of October. These defeats forced the British, under Lieutenant General Sir George White, to retreat into Ladysmith, which was promptly put under siege by the advancing Boers. This siege, although seeming like a great idea, actually hindered the Boers' chances of ending the war early, as it ate away at two of their greatest assets, manpower and time. The longer the siege dragged out, the closer the British relief army under Buller came. The British troops outside of Ladysmith fell back across the Tugela River and camped by Estcourt, which was 30 miles from the besieged town. In a counter to this, the Free State captured Frere, which was a short distance to the north of Estcourt. The British were in a dire situation and desperately needed reinforcements. The relief army arrived in the Cape Colony the day Ladysmith was put under siege, and Buller was faced with an enormous task. Ladysmith, Mafeking, and the diamond mining town of Kimberley were all besieged by the Boers. The British authorities in the Cape feared that this early Boer success would cause the non-Boer Cape Dutch, who lived under direct British rule, to rebel. The only course of action for Buller was to divide his army, giving command of a contingent to Lieutenant General Lord Methuen, to attack Kimberley, and Major General Getacare a small force to hold the Eastern Cape. The Irish in the British Army were formed into the 5th Brigade, consisting of the 1st Royal Dublin Fusiliers, 1st Inniskilling Fusiliers, 1st Connaught Rangers, and the 1st Border Regiment, under the command of Major General Fitzroy Hart. Recognising the impending conflict, reservists for the Inniskillings were called up, 468 of which presented themselves by the 19th of October, and of those 91% were declared fit for active duty. The full strength of the brigade was at 3,200 by the 15th of December. The British forces had amassed 16,000 highly trained and professional troops, led by General Sir Redvers Buller, against 12,000 Boer commandos, led by General Louis Botha. The British command in Natal sought to make use of their extensive rail network, and they began sending armoured trains to Estcourt on a daily basis to gather information on the Boer forces. The British knew that the Boers would soon sabotage the rail lines and wanted to make as much use of the system while it was still operational. On the 15th of November, a company of Royal Dublin Fusiliers mounted an armoured train along with some men of the Durban Light Infantry and a naval gun. This train also had amongst its passengers a war correspondent for the Morning Post, Winston Churchill. Churchill was a veteran of British action in India as well as the Anglo-Sudan War. However, he was officially in South Africa as a journalist. The train travelled north and was soon ambushed by a small Boer force at Chieveley, and due to the communication lines not being cut, the train was ordered back to Estcourt. The train was ambushed again, this time by a larger force of Boers, who had 2 field guns and a Maxim machine gun. The Boers had sabotaged the line, and the train hit a rock which derailed several carriages. Under heavy fire, Churchill helped to take command, and the engine was able to pass without any of its carriages. The wounded managed to escape, but the Dublin Fusiliers, the Light Durbans, and Churchill were captured. 80 men were taken prisoner by the Boers. The Boers held a defensive position, filled with strong natural defences such as the Tugela River and the Inhalwe Mountains of Monte Cristo and Estcourt, which were over 4,000 feet tall and heavily fortified by commandos. By the beginning of December 1899, Buller's forces had entered Durban and were bound for Estcourt by train. This force had, by this stage, grown to 18,000 infantry, 2,600 cavalry, and 36 guns. The Royal Navy also provided 2 4.7-inch guns as well as 14 12-pounder guns under the command of Captain Scott. In comparison, the Boers were believed to have roughly 30,000 men, with 6,000 of those needed to keep up the siege of Ladysmith. In a dispatch to London, Buller informed Lord Lansdowne that he believed that the Boer situation at Colenso was so well entrenched that it would be impregnable. Instead, he wanted to bypass the force to the west and relieve Ladysmith. Due to the previous defeats at Stormberg and Magersfontein on the 10th and 11th of December, British High Command was eager for a victory in the field, and Buller was to attack the Boer positions at Colenso as soon as possible. The British forces began to set out from Frere on the 12th of December and advanced to a Kjop 3 miles from Colenso. Once they had arrived at the Kjop, the British long-range naval guns began their shelling at the top of the opposite Kjop, where they believed the Boers had set up their positions. They had, in fact, entrenched themselves at the bottom of the hill for just this purpose. The Boers were ordered to not return fire on the British so as to maintain the secrecy of their positions. Buller's plan was to have mounted soldiers occupy Hillangwain Hill to the British right, while the Irish brigade crossed the Tugela on the far west at Bridle's Drift. Lyttelton's brigade would support the left, while Hildyard pushed the centre and Barton's brigade advanced on the right. All the while cover would be provided by the long-range naval guns. This was a solid plan, if the Boers would be where the British expected. The British infantry began their advance before dawn on the 15th, in full view of the entrenched Boers on the far side of the river. Botha had given instruction for the commandos to hold their fire until the British had fully committed an attack. At that range, the Boer fire from the smokeless muskets would be devastating. Botha had also placed charges on a road bridge crossing the Tugela, as the rail bridges had been blown by the Boers, so as to funnel the British into carefully chosen zones. The plan was to have the British commit to the attack, allow them to cross the river, and then blow the bridges, leaving troops stranded and exposed on the Boer side of the Tugela. This would have been a brilliant plan had the British managed to cross the river at all. The Irish brigade broke camp with the rest of the army before dawn and moved to the British left, as they were to cross the Tugela at a point called Bridle Drift. The brigade had one native guide who was supposed to bring them to the navigable drift. However, the guide spoke little to no English, despite map evidence for Bridle Drift being far to the west and out of immediate danger. The native guide was bringing Hart and his men to Punt Drift, which was in the middle of a salient in which the Boers had cover on the advancing brigade on three sides. This drift was a certain death trap, and Hart's officers knew it. They even protested to Hart that their intended crossing lay to the west, but Hart was adamant to follow the guide. Adding to the impending chaos was Hart's insistence on the Irish marching in close order as if they were on parade and not about to enter a battle in a fight for their lives. Seeing this madness, the commanding officer of the 1st Royal Dublin Fusiliers ordered his men to space out so as to avoid being cut down by rapid and accurate Boer fire. Upon seeing this, Hart ordered the men to close their ranks and advance in close order. The order was given and the Boers began to pour fire into the Irish. The initial deluge was ferocious. These magazine-fed rifles could, in trained hands, fire 15 rounds per minute. Hart described the chaos of the situation in the salient of the river as the brigade was being mown down by the relentless Boer fire. The infantry had advanced only a little way when a tremendous rifle fire was poured into us from our front, and a considerable rifle fire from our left front. There was no smoke, and not a sign of the enemy himself, or even a horse, but the streaks of dust as the Boer bullets showered in, grazing the ground, plainly showed where they were by a process of interpolation. The infantry lay down flat. Fire was new to them. I could see officers here and there urging on the advance, and All this was so far successful that a slow advance was made. Here and there men with better nerves pushed on. There was no panic, and once I said to a lot of men who were deaf to my commands to advance, "If I give you a lead, if your general gives you a lead, will you come on?" They answered quite cheerily with their brogues, "We will, sir," and up they jumped and forward they went. Time and experience are necessary to make men go well under fire. From the letters of Major General Hart. The clustered Irishmen were cut down in droves by the Boer sharpshooters. Hart had no support from either the cavalry contingent or the machine guns attached to the brigade, as the infantry had advanced too far ahead and left them behind. The advancing Irish men broke from their marching formation and into a battle line, spreading out to fill the treacherous ground between the loops of the Tugela. This long battle line meant it was nearly impossible to maintain a good command over the brigade. The supporting fire from 2 British field batteries had ceased, as they too were receiving a hail of fire from the Boer positions from across the river. Observing the unfolding engagement, General Botha noted the following in his official report of the battle: "Our burghers, as well as our artillery, allowed the enemy to advance unmolested to a range of about 1,500 yards with their guns, and having allowed the infantry to approach to approximately 500 yards, they suddenly unleashed a heavy fire. The enemy had orders to cross the river at this point, and although they stormed repeatedly, the fire of our burghers and artillery was so well directed and had such good effect that only a captain, 2 lieutenants, and a few men were able to reach the river bank. Here the enemy suffered a tremendous loss in dead and wounded." The Boers had laid barbed wire along the bottom of the Tugela where the drifts were, and some of the bravest men in the brigade managed to get into the river. Some even made it across, but upon seeing that there was nothing to be gained from the crossing, they fell back. Many men drowned in the river or fell victim to the merciless rifle fire directed at them from only 500 yards. After seeing the plight of the Irish, Buller eventually ordered the men to withdraw, and when the brigade received the orders, an officer of the Connaught Rangers took it to the men who were most advanced in the loop. Some of the Irish elected to stay behind and put up a rear guard to screen the withdrawal, and were either cut down or captured. With the artillery silent, Hart and his men were completely alone, being killed by the hidden enemy. The casualty report of the Irish was that 25 officers and 528 men had been either killed or wounded, making a total of 553 casualties in a disastrous engagement that lasted only about an hour. The 1st Royal Dublin Fusiliers were hit hardest, sustaining 216 killed and wounded of their 900 men. The casualties suffered by the Irish amounted to nearly half of all British casualties during the Battle of Colenso. Hart was heavily criticised for his lack of leadership, as it was deemed he did nothing to prevent the massacre. He failed to press the attack, forced his men to march in close order, and did not allow them to seek any cover from the storm of bullets, not to mention his insistence on following the native guide against all information he had from his highly detailed maps. He marched his men into a kill zone. As the Irish beat their retreat, the sound of the guns opened up again as the batteries covered their withdrawal. Although criticised, Hart and his men displayed incredible bravery, and he was lauded for following his orders and acting in the customs of a British officer at the time. However, his actions brought his men in the face of enfilading fire from Boers who were dug in and whose position was not known, despite the fact that the battle was over for the Irish Brigade. The Battle of Colenso was far from over. Towards the centre of the battle, the 2 British naval guns were directing their fire on the Boer positions at Fort Wiley on the eastern loop of the river. This bombardment on the Boer positions at Fort Wiley, This bombardment commenced at 4:45 a.m. at a range of 4,000 yards. The guns of the 14th and 66th Field Batteries were under the command of Colonel Long, and they too joined the attack on the fort. Long was a decorated veteran and had commanded the British guns at the Battle of Omdurman in the war against the Mahdists. Long was commended for his aggressive use and positioning of his artillery. Colonel Long had studied the Prussian use of artillery in the Franco-Prussian War, and had observed that they were most effective when positioned ahead of the infantry. He then moved his artillery forward closer to the river, so as to have more of an effect on the Boers. The artillery advanced past Hilliard, and his scouts reported no sign of Boers close enough to threaten the guns. This was a disastrous move, as the Boers had concealed themselves well, and waiting until the guns had been unlimbered, opened fire on the advanced artillery with their Mausers and field guns from a range of 300 yards. In a matter of moments the horses which brought the guns had been killed, as well as most of the gunners needed to operate the battery. Long was hit in the arm, and was shot in the liver in a maelstrom of lead, and was urged to retreat and abandon the guns. His response was said to have been, "Abandon be damned, we never abandon guns." One of the guns was eventually able to return fire, being operated by only 2 gunners, one of whom was promptly shot and the other had to withdraw to a small area of cover, where Long and the rest of the wounded were laying. The remaining 12-pounders were still 400 yards to the rear, and had suffered 4 wounded, and as such were able to return fire on the Boers, but it was proved largely ineffective. Meanwhile, on the British right at Llangwain, cavalry under Dundonald were gearing up to take the hill and drive the Boers off. The Boer fire from the hill directed on the British critically hampered the advance of Hildyard's infantry, and made their objective of crossing to the northern bank of the Tugela a near impossibility. Recognizing their precarious position on Llangwain, some Boers withdrew only for Botha to ask for volunteers to retake the position. The Boers had settled in with enough time to train their sights on the advancing British horse, and as Dundonald's men crested the hill, they were quickly forced to call for infantry reinforcements from Barton's regiment, holding their position in the centre of the British line. With the Irish attack on the left now in tatters, and the men in retreat, coupled with the devastating Boer guns from Fort Wiley, Barton was unable to send men to assist Dundonald. By now it was only 7 a.m., and Buller sent Hildyard's men to retrieve Long and his stranded artillery. After the chaos of the Irish advance, Hildyard marched his men in open order, and they even progressed to take Colenso, and managed to advance to the intact road bridge on the river. Long's abandoned guns were still in the open, and his wounded men were unable to move for fear of being killed by the inch-accurate Boers. To compound this, Dundonald's men were pinned down on the slopes of Llangwain by considerable Boer numbers. If Hildyard's infantry battalions could relieve the cavalry, not to mention the 8 fresh battalions of Barton and Lyttelton, the Boers could be driven off the hill with ease. Buller had committed less than half of his infantry to the battle, so the British numerical superiority was completely defunct. The disaster of Long's guns meant that the Boers had an advantage in artillery. If Buller was to wrestle victory from the jaws of defeat, the guns would have to be rescued. The first attempt to rescue the guns was proposed by Buller to his aide-de-camp, Captain Schofield. Amongst the volunteers were the Queen's grandson, Major Prince Christian Victor, Captain Schofield and Congreve, and Lieutenant Frederick Roberts. Roberts was the son of the Anglo-Irish Lord Roberts, who had won a Victoria Cross for his actions during the Indian Rebellion of 1857. The 4 officers were joined by 5 teams of horses, which were deemed sufficient to rescue the valuable guns. As the officers galloped towards Long, they were greeted by a hail of bullets which wounded Christian Victor, Congreve, and Roberts. Roberts was wounded in 3 places, and later succumbed to his wounds. Buller recommended the young officer for a Victoria Cross in a commendation that read: "At Colenso on the 15th December 1899, the detachments serving the guns of the 14th and 66th Batteries, Royal Field Artillery had all been either killed, wounded, or driven from their guns by infantry fire at close range, and the guns were deserted. About 500 yards behind the guns was a donga in which some of the few horses and drivers left alive were sheltered. The intervening space was swept with shell and rifle fire. Captain Congreve, Rifle Brigade, who was in the donga, assisted to hook a team into a limber, went out and assisted to limber up a gun. Being wounded, he took shelter, but, seeing Lieutenant Roberts fall, badly wounded, he went out again and brought him in. Captain Congreve was shot through the leg, through the toe of his boot, grazed on the elbow and the shoulder, and his horse shot in 3 places." The London Gazette, 2nd February 1900. The remaining teams reached 3 guns and began to pull them away, only for one of the guns to be struck by a Boer shell, leaving only 2 guns rescued. Long managed to escape with the successfully retrieved guns. There was another attempt to retrieve the guns, but that too met with failure, as it lost over 50% of its fighting strength and had to abandon the mission. Seeing the futility of further actions, Buller called for retreat. Hildyard withdrew from the town of Colenso, and Dundonald from Llangwain in a botched attempt which required the assistance of Barton. Some of Hart's men who did not hear the order were captured along with the remainder of Long's guns. When night fell, the Boers advanced across the river, and their victory was complete. In all, the British forces suffered 145 killed, 765 wounded, and 228 captured. The Boer losses were remarkably few, reportedly taking only 38 casualties, only 8 of which died. After the battle, Buller was relieved of command, and Lord Roberts was given charge of the British forces in South Africa on 17th of December, just 2 days after the battle. Once the Boers had exhausted their most valuable resources of time and manpower, the war turned in favour of the British. The British then went on the offensive from the start of 1900. As a result of the dwindling resources, the Boers resorted to guerrilla-style warfare. In response to these attacks, the British adopted scorched earth tactics and brought a new and terrifying concept to the art of war: concentration camps. These camps were the brainchild of British military hero Lord Kitchener, who became a field marshal during the First World War. From June 1901 to May 1902, over 115,000 people were held in these camps, and almost 28,000 Boers lost their lives there. Almost 22,000 of these were children, and this figure represents roughly 10% of the entire Boer population. A further 20,000 native black people were held in separate camps, and roughly 20,000 died there. The war ended on the 31st of May 1902, with Britain emerging the victor. The Crown retained dominion over the 2 Boer republics under the Treaty of Vereeniging. The war cost the British an estimated equivalent of over £200 billion. The British forces lost 22,092 killed, 75,430 returned home sick or wounded, with a further 23,000 wounded and 934 missing. The Boers lost over 6,000 killed, 24,000 captured, and 21,000 guerrilla forces captured at the end of the war. The conflict proved the effectiveness of guerrilla tactics, which many Irishmen brought home and employed with great effect during the Irish War of Independence and Civil War. Well, thanks very much for writing that episode for us, Sam. And if you'd like to write a script for us, or you have an idea for a subject that you'd like to have covered, just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org. And do consider becoming a patron. You can do so at patreon.com/The History Network. Once again, thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Sam de Turberville, read by Nick Barker.